Our scripture reading this morning comes from the book of Nehemiah. If I asked you to open your Bibles and race to the book of Nehemiah, how many would you get there? That's what we don't often preach from, so I'm looking forward to that this morning. Nehemiah, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, is tasked with some important work as the people of Israel are coming out of exile. He is tasked with the work of building a wall around the city of Jerusalem. And so we will look at that this morning. Our scripture reading is from chapter 1 through 11, but we will kind of talk through most of the book and look at what's happening in his life. God gives us the task of work, and so we shift this morning to looking at the messiness of work. The words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah. In the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa, Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile and also about Jerusalem. They said to me, those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire. When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. Then I said, Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you. We have acted very wickedly towards you. We have not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant Moses. Remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. They are your servants and your people, whom you redeemed by your great strength and your mighty hand. Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man. I was cupbearer to the king. Amen. Your work can be a ministry. Your work can be a ministry. Whether that work takes place in the private sector or in the government, whether that work takes place in the church, your work can be a ministry. Your work, whether it's inside the home or outside the home, can be a ministry. Your work on the sports field and your work in the classroom can be a ministry. Work. The people of Israel had been exiled by the Babylonians. They were having been scattered among the nations. And yet they are called back around 545 BC. So some Israelites return and they begin the process of rebuilding. We talked about that a little bit when we looked at the prophet Haggai a few weeks back. But we come this morning to Nehemiah, who, along with Ezra, returned to Jerusalem about 100 years later after that initial group came back to Israel. We heard this morning Nehemiah's prayer. He's praying for God to use him through his work. We're told at the very end that he is cupbearer to the king. Cupbearer to the king. He is cupbearer to the king of Persia, Artaxerxes. And as part of that role, he was in a pretty comfortable job. He got to help manage the finances of the kingdom. He was tasked with being a companion to the king of Persia. He even got to select the wine that the king would drink. But there's the one downside. He had to taste it as well to make sure it wasn't poisoned. But he had a pretty good gig going on. And yet, he learns of Jerusalem's state and the state of the people who are living there. And he is anguished. It appears that even though the exiles had returned, there was something going on. We're told in Ezra that the city gates had burned. And so there's a building project that needs to be done. Nehemiah is anguished. And when he learns of Jerusalem's state, he goes through a career change. He goes from being cupbearer to the king to being governor of the province of Judah. He, as governor, as an administrator, is tasked with rebuilding the wall. The work God calls us to sometimes takes us by surprise. Sometimes God calls us, as part of our work, to go into dark and scary places. I was reading a book this week, and here's how the book begins. It's at a firehouse, and they are rededicating this building after having made some improvements. Good days and bad days, up days and down days, sad days, happy days, but never a boring day on this job. You do what God has called you to do. You show up. You put one foot in front of another. You get on the rig and you go out and you do the job, which is a mystery and a surprise. You have no idea when you get on that rig, no matter how big the call, no matter how small. You have no idea what God is calling you to, but He needs you. He needs me. He needs all of us. Those words were spoken by Father Michael Judge, chaplain of the FDNY, on September 10th, 2001. Sometimes as part of our work, God calls us to go into dark and scary places. But your work can be a ministry. Those heroes on 9/11 heard the call, and they responded. The work God calls us to may be done during a time of opposition, or it can create conflict as well. As you move deeper into Nehemiah, we find there's some opposition to this building project. The work on the wall has begun, and there's opposition coming from Samaria. When Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, Nehemiah says, he became angry and was greatly incensed. He ridiculed the Jews, and in the presence of his associates and the army of Samaria, he said, "What are those feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from those heaps of rubble, burned as they are?" Sometimes when you're doing God's work, the enemy will come at you. When you're doing the thing that God has called you to do, sometimes you're going to get attacked. The opposition continues. The wall's actually been completed, and yet this force, the enemy, is still coming at Nehemiah. When our enemies heard about the wall, Excuse me, let me back up 1 second. The people in Samaria began to send notes to Nehemiah asking him to meet with them. They wanted to kind of draw him out of the city so that they could kill him. But Nehemiah keeps writing back and saying, I'm not meeting with you. I'm working on this project that God has called me to. And then the Samaritans begin to concoct a scheme. They're going to tell the king of Persia that instead of being governor of Judah, Nehemiah is actually trying to become king. He's going to try to make the king of Persia jealous. And so Nehemiah sends this reply. Nothing like what you are saying is happening. You are just making it up out of your head. They were all trying to frighten us, thinking their hands will be too weak for the work, and it will not be completed. But I prayed, now strengthen my hands. Strengthen my hands, God, for the work that you have called me to. That is the prayer. Your work can be a ministry. You hear the call, and then you respond. Do you remember the video I posted on the church page on Facebook this week? It was the video of this horrible situation, this time in Texas where they're going through a lot of conflict because a white female police officer went in and she appears to, or says she went into the wrong apartment and shot a black man. And this is, of course, unearthing all of these tensions in the community. And so it's been pretty significantly covered in the news. Well, during the sentencing hearing, the victim's brother was giving a victim impact statement. And sitting there on the stand, he turns to Amber Geiger, this police officer, and he tells her that he loves her. He tells her that he forgives her. And then he turns to the judge and asks if he can go give her a hug. And so these two unlikely people, one whose brother was shot and killed, the other, the convicted murderer, come together and they embrace. But that's not the end of the story. Brian shared a second video with me a couple days ago. The judge in that case took her personal Bible and went down to this now convicted murderer and sat down and she began to show her scripture. She took her to the Gospel of John, where it says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whosoever believeth in him will never perish but have everlasting life." The judge in the middle of the courtroom did this. And then she too embraced the convicted murderer. Your work can be a ministry. God calls us as individuals, but we don't go it alone. This wall, this building project that Nehemiah was overseeing, was completed in 52 days. And so he says, when our enemies heard about this, all the surrounding nations were afraid and lost their confidence, because they realized that this work had been done with the help of God. Your work can be a ministry. Nehemiah was not a great prophet. He wasn't a pastor. He was an administrator. He was a governor overseeing a building project. He heard a need and he responded. For what purpose? He was building a wall so that the people could return to Jerusalem and be safe from their enemies. He was building a wall so that Ezra the priest could reestablish the Torah in the holy city of Jerusalem. He He was overseeing a building project, but God had a greater purpose in mind. And so we go to chapter 8. When the seventh month came, and the Israelites had settled in their towns, all the people came together as one in the square before the water gate. They told Ezra, the teacher of the law, to bring out the book of the law of Moses, which the Lord had commanded for Israel. Ezra read it aloud from daybreak until noon as he faced the square before the water gate, in the presence of the men, women, and others who could understand. And all the people listened attentively to the book of the law. The name Nehemiah means Yahweh has comforted. Through Nehemiah's work, he is a source of comfort. Your work can be a ministry. The late seminary professor and Disciples of Christ preacher, Fred Craddock, once told a story about a man who was working in a restaurant. You see, Fred Craddock was out in Winnipeg in Canada, out there to deliver some remarks over a multi-day conference. But after the first night, they all got snowed in. No planes were leaving or coming. Pretty much shut down the entire city. And so the event organizer reached out to Craddock and told him, listen, the hotel you're staying in doesn't have any food, but if you can get the door open, walk down the street. There's a bus station restaurant. And if you can get there, there's a man there who will be serving food. Well, Craddock walks into the restaurant, and it is packed. Every table has been taken up. He says that it seems like the whole city of Winnipeg was there. And there was no place for him to sit. Until somebody moved over in the booth and said, come sit at our table. Come sit at our table. And so Craddock did. He sat down at a table with some strangers so that they could share a meal together. Well, this man comes up to him, it's a big guy, and he's got this big, greasy apron on. And he walks up to Craddock and says, what for you? Well, Fred says, back up, I'd like to see a menu if that's possible. And he said, you can have soup. That's it. Craddock said, well, I don't typically have soup for breakfast. And he said, it's soup or not. Craddock said, well, soup actually sounds pretty good to me right now. And so the man went away and returned with this cup of soup. Craddock said it was hot, but it was the color of a mouse. He said he tasted it and it was the worst thing he had ever had in his life. He reeled against the heavens and Winnipeg for having this soup. He looked around and couldn't understand, how are these people eating this soup? Just then, the doors of the restaurant blow open again. And a woman comes in and stands there. Clearly, she is a woman from the street. She has no covering for her head, despite being out in the snow. So there's snow that is gathered and collected in her hair. She was wearing a series of coats so that she could try to stay warm. She walks in, and there's nowhere for her to sit, until a group of people scoot over and say, here, come sit at our table. You can eat with us. So that same big, greasy man walks up, doing his job, walks up to the woman and says, what for you? She says, I'd like a glass of water. He says, water is only for paying customers. "What for you?" She said, "I really just need a glass of water." He says, "Order something or get out." She said, "Can't I even just stay here to get warm?" He said, "Get up and get out." And so the woman stood up from this table and began to move to the exit. And then every other person in the restaurant stood up with her, and they all began to walk out. The chef sees what's happening, and he says, wait. Everybody come and sit down. I will bring her some soup." And so everybody sat down. He brought her this bowl of gray soup. And they began to eat. Fred Craddock began to eat his soup. The woman began to eat. And as he was eating, he turned to one of the people who had made room for him at this table. And he said, "Who was that?" And they turned to him and they said, "We don't know. But if she ain't welcome, we ain't welcome." And so Craddock continued eating his soup. He finished that bowl of soup. And as he finished, he said, "You know what? That soup tasted pretty good." He said it tasted actually really good. It tasted familiar to him. He said it tasted like bread and juice.